Well, paleoanthropology looks at the study of human evolution, and we're interested in our past, and that encompasses a great many areas of many additional subfields of specialization. Mostly within paleoanthropology, we're interested in the transition of how humans evolved from our great ape family, which includes our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos. We know from molecular evidence, as well as fossil evidence, that humans, the lineage that ultimately led to humans, as well as the lineage that ultimately led to bonobos and chimpanzees, split roughly somewhere between about 4 and 8 million years ago. And so we're really interested in terms of, from a paleoanthropological perspective, seeing how that transition occurred and then what happened afterwards, and what's happened during the past 4 to 5 to 6 million years within the evolution of the human family. 50 years ago and more, that was always sort of looked at as being a sort of a linear transition from one species to a next, each one becoming more and more evolved. But we now know that that's incorrect, and the evolution of our family, of the human family, is just like the evolution of all other animal families. There's a lot of diversity that has come and gone at various points in the past, and sometimes the family tree gets incredibly bushy, and other times it gets trimmed. The only thing that we can be certain of is that today we're the only species left of the entire family that was once that lived on Earth at different times over the past 5 million years. If we're looking for the sort of the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, we're looking at a species that existed somewhere between 4 and 8 million years ago, probably closer to between 6 and 8 million years ago based on the fossil records that we have. So for instance, the oldest fossils that most scientists agree are hominin are between 4 and 7 million years old. And then after that, we're then seeing the transition from sort of early, the evolution of early hominins, so early members of the human family tree, evolving different types of specializations. Some of them are then the characteristics that define what it means to be within the genus Homo. But there were many other ways of being human that have now gone extinct. It's all about living and reproducing, right? And the more certain individuals reproduce, the more descendants they leave. And the characteristics, we all look like our families, right? We share most of our characteristics, and over time, that's what happens. Certain lineages and certain populations go extinct, and that genetic variation, that diversity, as well as the morphological diversity that comes with it, then begins to disappear. Sometimes it's easy for certain things to re-evolve under natural selection. In other cases, it's much more difficult. So it's complex, and it's context specific, and that's where paleoanthropology and especially archaeology come in, is not only finding some of the answers to when certain things evolved or when they went extinct, but understanding the whole context, the environmental context and the behavioral context within which these features have evolved. From a paleoanthropological perspective, we know that early hominins reached Flores at least 1 million years ago, based on stone tools that are found in the central part of Flores. In that area, we have stone tools that are dated from between about 800,000 years ago to 1 million years ago. So our own species, Homo sapiens, that now lives throughout the world, right, only evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago. Our species first began to disperse outside of Africa 100,000 years ago. That's a long time after earlier hominins were had already dispersed throughout Eurasia into Southeast Asia, and we now know that even reached Flores, made it across the Wallace Line. So in that respect, it's fascinating because as an island that is so difficult to get to for most other terrestrial animals, it provides almost like an experimental setting. When we're studying hominins on the continental mainland, it's a lot more complex because you've got a lot more of interactions between different species. You're not sure, has this species come in and went extinct, or has another species come in, perhaps mixed? Those sort of questions come up. But with Flores, it's so different and it's so removed that it becomes almost like an experimental setting that you could set up in a lab. And to have humans involved in that is really interesting because we can try and trace some of how the evolutionary pressures affected human evolution in this particular type of setting by taking away many of the other things that might interact with them elsewhere, including, even if you want to compare it to the African savanna, for instance, where you have a whole set of carnivores that are competing with early hominins. As early hominin toolmakers are first learning how to scavenge from carcasses and incorporate more meat into their diet, they're competing with hyenas, with lions, a whole suite of a carnivore guild that's highly evolved to do what it does, and hominins are in there competing. Here on Flores, it's completely different. All those carnivores, we have no evidence of them here. The main carnivore that was here is the Komodo dragon. And so it's a very different scenario that by removing some of these other factors makes it really interesting to study. What happened here on Flores is that because of the stone tools that had been discovered in central Flores that dated at that time to roughly 800,000 years ago, there was an interest to look for more places to work on Flores to not only perhaps find early hominins, but also to trace sort of our own species and how we got initially populated Australia 50,000 years ago. And researchers from the National Center for Archaeology in Indonesia had worked at Liang here for many years, initially starting in the late 70s and continuing until 1989. And it was already known to be a really terrific site, but they had only excavated down within the Holocene, within sediments that date within the Holocene, so the past 10,000 years roughly. And they decided to begin a collaboration with Mike Morwood from, at that point, the University of New England, and later moved to the University of Wollongong, to begin excavating here and to sort of remove the backfill from some of those earlier excavations and see if there actually were deposits that went deeper. It had been interpreted previously that because near the bottom of some of those deposits it seemed to be sterile or archaeological sterile, that maybe there were no deposits older, but they sort of thought, let's go through that and see what we find. And soon, during their work in the early part of the 2000s, they began to find the remains of stegodon, which is an extinct form of elephant. And soon after that, they also had some human bones, although at the time they weren't sure what human they belonged to. But then in 2003, over at the side of the cave there, a partial skeleton was recovered. And this partial skeleton, when it was published, essentially shocked the entire paleoanthropological community just for its sheer unexpectedness. It looks a lot more like, the way we usually like to explain it is if you were to uncover a partial skeleton like that in Africa, say in East Africa and Ethiopia, in sediments that dated somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million years ago, be fine. That's exactly what we expect to find in that area at that time. But to find it all the way over here on Flores, across the Wallace line, and at the time the dating evidence suggested it was roughly 18,000 years old. Well, this is now overlapping with our species and overlapping in time with Neanderthals, and potentially overlapping when early members of our species were first moving through this area and ultimately reaching Australia. I was basically looking at the evolution of the wrist morphology, particularly with trying to understand the origins and the evolution of stone tool behavior in hominins. And so, or those behavioral innovations, how they may have affected the evolution of our hand in comparison to our closest living relatives, the great apes. And a pattern was already starting to emerge, showing that many of the features that are characteristic of modern human hands, we share them with Neanderthals. But those characteristics, we don't see them in earlier hominins prior to 2.5 to 3 million years ago. So it suggests that some of the features that are unique to the hands of humans and Neanderthals evolved after the advent of stone tool manufacture. And so in that sense, it makes sense that the behavioral innovation comes first, and then some populations actually evolve some morphological specializations for those behaviors. They become more and more committed to it. And so when I was first asked to examine the wrist bones of Homo Floresiensis, it was an interesting test because I was predicting they should look like humans and Neanderthals because, they're tool making and they've evolved from a common ancestor with humans and Neanderthals. But it turns out that they actually show the primitive condition. They show features that are much more similar to what we see in earlier hominins prior to 3 million years ago. So again, it suggested that the split between the populations that ultimately led to Homo Floresiensis here and humans and Neanderthals in Africa and Eurasia was much deeper. Some were probably closer to 2 million years or even older. At the time, it was different. In the context of the debate over Homo Floresiensis, initially there were many people that had questions about, well, could there really be a primitive hominin species that survived on Flores up until the late Pleistocene? Many people, many scientists, that was a difficult idea to swallow. And so many thought we're searching for other explanations, perhaps pathology, perhaps that they're just another member of our species that had some type of genetic defect or something like that to explain the morphology that was found. And at the time, most of that was focused on the head because the brain size of Homo Floresiensis is essentially roughly about 400 cubic centimeters, which is the same as a chimpanzee. And it's similar to early hominins that lived earlier than 2 million years ago. So to have that just didn't seem to make sense that we could find another human species with those conditions. And so there was this idea that, well, pathology must explain it. But from detailed analyses of, from the head all the way down to the toes, all of the anatomy points toward what we would expect to find in another primitive hominin species, including the wrist bones. Because if it was a pathological modern human that had some kind of genetic disease, then the way that the wrist bones develop in terms of when they develop during embryonic and early fetal development, they already have their characteristics. These evolved characteristics that humans and Neanderthals share already show up. Whether the bones can become deformed or after that point is fine, they're not going to deform back into what we expect to see in a chimpanzee or an earlier hominin species. We do know from around the world during the late Pleistocene, it's a common feature where changes in the climate, changes in the environment, cooler and drier temperatures over tens of thousands of years drove many large animals to extinction. Where it gets extra interesting is during this time is also when our species is dispersing rapidly across the world. And so, it's often the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, that, modern humans seem to be appearing in areas and appearing in ecosystems that are already under significant pressure from environment and climate changes, and having humans then enter that ecosystem as a new and very efficient and smart predator sort of changes the ball game. And so in some cases, some of the animals have likely gone extinct because of that. But again, it's interesting research because you're trying to tease apart, well, how much was the modern human component to driving some of these things to extinction, when in many cases, many of the lineages may have already went extinct just prior to modern humans arriving. So here on Flores, that's a big question for us, is there any evidence that modern humans, our species, was actually here on Flores at the same time as Homo Floresiensis, and if so, was there ever any interaction? Up till now, we have no evidence whatsoever that they were here at the same time. So it still seems to be that there may have been natural reasons for the ecosystem here going extinct, including Stegodon, including Homo Floresiensis, and many of the other animals that are associated with them. Why Flores is interesting is because its fauna is so depauperate, meaning there's not many, because Flores has always been an oceanic island, it's never been connected to either continental mainlands on either side of it. And so it's sort of whatever visitors, you could think of it as another planet that didn't have life initially, and then whatever sort of got there managed to get in first. And so other animals that we'd normally expect to come in or go out at various times if it was part of a continent or attached to a continent didn't occur. So you get a very interesting combination of animals sort of forging out their own unique ecosystem, if you will. Essentially, the model that's been published in terms of island dwarfism or the island rule, including gigantism, is based on data from a number of species, and there's a slight trend where animals living in islands or other restricted ecosystems. And it doesn't have to be an island that's surrounded by water. It can be an island within a continental area that's just somehow there's barriers there that restrict access to resources. And so the model predicts that animals over a certain size will get smaller in order to be able to maintain their population numbers, whereas animals that are under a certain size may get larger. However, the data, the story is much more complex underneath that, because it seems to affect certain lineages, certain animals more than others, and it's not just a rule that can be applied across the board. And when we're looking at Homo Floresiensis, this is where we really need to be cautious, because in the past, humans were small in Africa as well. And so at this point, until we're absolutely certain what Homo Floresiensis evolved from, we don't know. It may have arrived here on the island already being small-bodied and small-brained. So those features may not have been a consequence of being isolated on Flores. They may have been a consequence of when their ancestor dispersed from Africa and what features they had at that time. So the debate now is, or the main question we're trying to answer is, Homo Floresiensis descended from something like Homo erectus, which we usually reconstruct as being much larger brained and having body proportions like us, like modern humans, where our legs are proportionally longer than our arms, and that significantly larger body sizes, so more similar to modern humans. But many of the features that we find in Homo Floresiensis look similar to hominins that existed in Africa prior to Homo erectus. So for instance, early species of Homo, where they still have body proportions, where their arms are longer than their legs, they still tend to be smaller, and they also have smaller brain sizes. And so that's the main question. Until we can resolve that, we can't really address whether Homo Floresiensis is an island dwarf descendant of Homo erectus, of a larger-bodied Homo erectus, or if it's just the descendant and is looking very similar to its ancestor when it arrived here on Flores. I'm fascinated by evolution and the way that variation and the way that diversity comes about. You know, just even coming here to Flores today and meeting the people and the diversity of culture and customs, all of this it's fascinating, and that's just one facet of it. You know, around the world that we have this knowledge of what it means to be human in that way, and I'm very much interested in understanding, adding to that by understanding more about Homo Floresiensis. That, you know, here if we think of modern humans and try and know everything we can about us, we're still only in this part. Every time we add Neanderthals, we begin to learn a little bit more, and add Homo Floresiensis, we learn more and more. And so understanding all the different ways that there are to be human that are well outside the boundaries of what we can conceive of as modern humans, as Homo sapiens. When we're looking at questions like that, we need to approach it from a comparative context. So we need to understand relative to chimpanzees, gorillas, you know, our closest living relatives, and all great apes have a certain capacity for language. So you can think of many great apes in captivity that can speak and sign language. So certainly early hominins, there's no question they would have had a certain capacity for language that is certainly more than what we see in other mammalian species. And they certainly would have been communicating in ways that we would recognize at least as sort of proto-language type things. But to say that they, you know, were speaking a language like we would see around the world today, probably not, because many of these may have even only evolved within our species. From the remains that have been discovered at Liang, we know that Homo Floresiensis would have stood about 1 meter high. Their brains are about a third the size of ours. So essentially looking, you know, we think of us even as young children, our brains grow very, very quickly. So, you know, even a small child's skull is already quite a lot larger than what Homo Floresiensis was like. But in that sense, so very small brain, small stature. Their body proportions look very different. So it's not that they're just short. That's not, people seem to focus, oh, they're only a meter tall. That means, by itself, that doesn't mean anything. The fact is the proportions of all the segments in the body of Homo floresiensis are different than they are in modern humans, even modern humans that are dwarfed. We still have, in modern humans, our legs are really long. This is an evolutionary change that's occurred within the human lineage after Homo erectus. And so their legs would have look relatively shorter, and so therefore their arms look longer. And their feet are also proportionally large compared to their legs in comparison to us. Also, they lack a bony chin, so they look like other archaic hominins, including Neanderthals. So they have a whole suite of primitive features that are no longer found in our species.
All that earned them a nickname, didn't it?
Well, it earned the nickname of the Hobbit. And well, they didn't, at that time when the nickname was, it was partly because in Australia and New Zealand, of course, with the filming of the Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, it was all happening around the same time, and the Discovery team at the time just sort of had mentioned Hobbit, and it kind of stuck. And then after the fact, it turned out that they do actually have large feet. So that wasn't part of the nickname, but it worked out nicely.